to episode 1, the first official episode of the Sport Science Collective podcast. I'm here with my 3 co-hosts, the great man Sandon Inchirisi, Ryan Leder, and Jared Bailey.
Hey, all.
G'day.
Hey, before we start, anyone who wants to find out a little bit about us can go back to our intro episode or 0 or pre-episode. We've got lots of names for it. It's on YouTube. It's also on Spotify, Apple. Where else do you chuck it, let's see?
On Google Podcasts as well.
Yeah. All right. So
Just the major platforms. Thanks, Letsy.
Yep.
Yeah.
And will it be appearing on Amazon as well?
Oh, nice. Geez, you're all over it. Yeah. What about iHeartRadio? Deezer.
We're too big for them.
Too
Pulse
big?
Radio. Pulse Radio.
That's when you know you made it, mate.
We'll be on local ABC radio though. Don't worry.
Good. So if you want to know a bit more about us, then you can go back to that episode. But very briefly, my name's Ryan. I have a PhD in exercise science, and my background's mostly in kind of biomechanics, physiology. We have to the left of my screen, Ryan Leder, he's studying his PhD, look at determinants of fast bowling, also got an honours degree in workload and sports science, and a master's from Edith Cowan in strength and conditioning. Jared Bailey just submitted his PhD looking at heart rate variability, heart rate on kinetics to determine a field test, to see whether or not that can predict fatigue and readiness to play.
Correct.
And Sandon, I described him as last week the Italian John Daly of the golf course, has a Doctor of Physiotherapy and also an honours degree in exercise science.
And if I'm not mistaken, by the way, I think you might have kicked the winning goal on the weekend.
Yeah, tell us about that, mate.
Talk us through it. Talk us through it.
Oh,
Have a look, lads.
he's got it. Yes.
Oh, crikey.
Here we go.
Oh.
So we're deep in the fourth quarter. We're only up by, I think, 4 points. This is to seal it. 2 minutes to go.
It's the Italian Tony Lockett.
Good 60 metres out here.
Oh,
No,
look at
it's
this.
Bang!
Oh, look at that. That's a
Straight
beautiful drop.
through the middle.
Sausage
Straight-
roll.
Oh, guys, make sure you go watch this video. It's an absolute perler.
Sando, that's pretty good off 7 years away from the game, mate.
7 years. Yes.
How's the hammy feeling after that big drop punt?
Mate, I was very, very sore after that game. I could barely walk. I had to get home and actually do up a barbecue. And like the old Simpsons episode with Homer putting it together, it looked very much unlike the image that was given to me. So I think I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board on that one.
Where the hell is Le Grill? Good stuff.
Yeah, no,
Well, well done, Sando. Good kick.
Thanks, mate.
Mm.
It was a great feeling. Boys all got around me and just had to let the opposition know that I've just sealed the game.
Mm.
Yeah. Hey, the opposite end of that spectrum is you, Baz. But how are you feeling this week, mate?
Well, cricket season's over. Thank. That's been a long season, given COVID and the extension and everything. But yeah, no, since cricket's finished, I've ended up tweaking my back from doing nothing. So I'm currently crumpled over like an origami.
Do you know my worst back injury, which was a lumbar disc herniation at L4, L5, was from getting out of bed. Like I sat up and turned my legs off to the side and bang, went. Yeah.
Well, I couldn't
put me
even
out for
tell you
6
what I've
months.
done. Yeah, I've just.
Do you guys know any good physios?
Nope.
Hey, when I did this, you were still studying, mate. I could have got a cheap rate. Maybe I should have gone and seen you. Hey, so let's jump into some of our topics for this week. So this is our first episode, as I mentioned. It's going to be a bit of a trial episode, I guess, in the sense that we've got some ideas about what we'd like to do, but we want to know from all of you lovely listeners and watchers as well, whether or not you like the format, if you want us to change it, etc. Thanks to those that sent through some listener questions. Good to know some people got around the pre-episode. So the first thing what we want to talk about was this idea about how we were going to bring an article or a topic or an idea each week. And the first one here is it's an Olympic season. We're going into the qualifying period, and there's always some controversy surrounding Olympic years. Can you get out the image for us there? So for those of you not playing along at home, so you can't see the article that's popped up on the screen here. It's just an article about great British athlete Charlotte Purdue, who missed out on her Olympic spot despite running the second fastest time. Now, whether or not you like running, persevere, because we are going to be talking about lots of things to do with readiness to return to play after injury, external load, internal load, how someone's training might look as they return from an injury. So this specific case, though, so Team GB recently announced three women who are presenting Tokyo at the marathon. So there's Steph Davis, who won the recent Great Britain Marathon Trials in a time of 2:27.16. Steph Twell, who was the third fastest with a time of 2:26.40. Then Charlotte Purdue, who was the second fastest time in 2:25.38. And then the fastest time was Jess Piasecki in 2:25.29, so 9 seconds ahead. But there's a fair old gap there between second and third spot. But Charlotte Purdue was left off the team. So she had an injury about 18 months ago, and she'd been told that she'd been selected for the marathon, and she'd received medical exemption to sit out the Olympic trials. However, she's since been excluded based on the evidence that selectors were told that she was only running 30 to 35 minutes per week.
What was her injury 18 months ago, Warnie?
That's a good question there. Do you want to look that up for me while I keep reading? So she was told that, or selectors were told that she was only running 30 to 35 minutes per week, and so she was in an injury risk leading up to the games. But she's actually running 130 kilometers a week and building on that. So her coach from Australia, Nick Bideau, said that she's running consistently. She's up to returning to kind of peak mileages, and she's at some of her career best times. And Charlotte herself said it baffles her how Great British Athletics have reached the decision, and she's concerned that she has not been selected because of Mickey Mouse evidence, false information that isn't based on facts. So she's pursuing legal recourse based on that. And it turns out that the info that was provided to some of those selectors was based on her Strava files, which is not that clear, because a lot of the pro athletes don't even upload their stuff to Strava. So you're not getting kind of the full picture. Now that's a bit of saucy goss for you, but the reason I thought it's a good article to discuss there is because it talks about injury risk and return to play after an injury. So, Baz, did you have any luck finding the injury there, mate?
Yeah, it's a quad niggle. She was up in after World Marathon Championships in Valencia. She and her training partner headed up to Font-Romeu for 4 weeks of altitude training prior to the London Marathon. And during her first week up there, she stopped during an easy run with quad pain. And that's
hardly severe. It's not like an Achilles rupture or something. So I guess the question is for you guys, and I can chime in at some point too. Like,
sorry, just to butt in, it was a stress reaction in her femur.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay. So how do we kind of quantify injury risk, or what is an injury risk, and should the sports science / medical team be making the decisions on whether or not someone is at risk? What does the science say about training load and injury risk? So, Sandro, I'm going to go straight to you as our as our doctor of physiotherapy. Hey, is DPT a term used in Australia, or is that an American term?
Yeah, it's used here as well.
Yeah, you're the big DPT, the goal kicker.
Plugger.
Yeah, the plugger. What's the difference between a contact and a non-contact and an overuse injury?
Well, obviously, the biggest difference between contact and non-contact is having an external force impact a player or athlete. So obviously, with running, unless you're running across the road and unfortunately not fast enough to get across, you may have contact with the vehicle. Or if you're running along a healthy or favourite running or cycling track, there may be contact there. But a non-contact type of injury is the result of internal forces acting on the body, and obviously a key or major non-contact injury, especially here in Australia, is an ACL injury is commonly a non-contact injury due to the rotary forces going through the knee, or anterior translation of your tibia on the femur. So there's sort of the main difference between non-contact and contact. But an overuse injury is if an athlete is overreaching throughout their training or competition period, and it's taking into account recovery periods as well, and
not having enough recovery, Sando.
Yeah, not having enough recovery in between your training periods, and obviously as you get closer to performance periods before you start tapering, that's when you're going to have your highest, I guess, loads of training, and that's when an athlete is going to be at sort of their highest risk of an overuse injury. And so it's slightly different, of course, across the board there, and I guess a stress reaction would come under a more overuse injury in that case. And 18 months ago, to me, sounds like she should have well and truly recovered from that. But obviously, I'm not all across her training history.
So just to recap for those that might have struggled there. So contact involves a collision. Non-contact is kind of acute movement related. So you might have moved in a faulty way, as you mentioned, tibia translation, or it might be a hamstring strain when you kick the ball too far. And overuse are those things that are repetitive motions that lead to an injury.
Yes.
So based on that, we're not going to talk about contact injuries because they're just too hard to predict. You don't really know what's going to happen, particularly in team sports. Running's a little unique because you could say contact is the collision each time you collide with the ground. Each time your foot hits the ground. But for all intents and purposes, the literature kind of looks at collision injuries as impact injuries. So where someone's running into something else. So looking at the latter two, non-contact and overuse, what can you tell me about training load? So Letty, I'm going to throw to you because your honours was on this a bit. What is the big picture about training load and injuries?
Well, so the main thing about training loads is obviously you're training to perform in your sport, but there's different ways to get to that point to be able to play your sport and play your sport well. So it's more about the journey with training loads. So one of the things that I looked at in my honours was how big were the changes from one week to the other in terms of how much running an athlete might do. And the line of thinking 5 years ago was that these massive changes from one week to the other is what's going to tip you over the edge for a non-contact injury, for example. So hamstring injuries are very common in AFL's matches, unfortunately. And they think that that's related to large spikes in increased sprinting loads. So understanding the type of loads that individuals are doing during training can help you sort of manipulate training to try and reduce that chance of an overreaching or overtraining an athlete in a particular movement pattern, for example.
So knowing that, so you want to understand those loads. How do you quantify those loads? Baz, how would I quantify a player or an athlete's load?
Well, training load can exist in any number of forms, but typically what we're talking about and what Letsy's talking about is external training load. So I guess all of the movements that we put the athletes through day to day, and they can be measured as total distance. So, like for example, footballers might measure the total amount of running that they do, just all of it. We might look at how many collisions they're involved in by using the accelerometer. We might also break down their external training load or their running into speed zones. So how much running did they complete above a certain threshold? So maybe max speed. How much running did they complete between two thresholds? And how much running did they complete in sort of low speed? So low speed, moderate speed, and high speed. And we can start to profile their running based load into different categories and start to look at that across the week and across the month and across the season, to try and sort of chart it and see how much they're doing of each of those types of loads.
And so that's external load, which is talking about kind of the quantifying what's actually done in terms of work.
Mm-hmm.
And for non-team sport athletes who are involved in perhaps cycling, running, for instance, you might look at things like power,
Yep.
or pace for a given distance.
Yep.
But there's also internal load, and one of the kind of things that straddles a little bit of both is heart rate, because it is an internal measure, but it's also quantifiable. But often those internal loads are not necessarily so quantifiable. So, and what are those internal loads that we tend to use? Because the reason I asked that question, it tells us a little bit about the quality of how that athlete responds to that load.
Yeah.
So me performing a workload
Mm-hmm.
and you performing a workload, we're not going to experience it the same way. So
Yeah.
so you might deal with it better or worse.
Yeah, especially if you're talking about the same workload. So you and I might run at 12 kilometres per hour on the treadmill for 30 minutes, but have a totally different internal load response. And so ways that we can measure our unique response to that exercise stimulus, or for this example, the 12 k's an hour, we can measure heart rate. So if my heart rate is at a higher percentage of my max, it means I'm working harder. So my heart is pumping more blood around my body to be delivered to the working muscles. And so quite simply, your heart rate is a good indicator of your internal load. We could take some blood samples, so we could look at, lactate or blood lactate, which is an indicator of anaerobic performance. And we can start to, I guess, look at, if we had gas analysis equipment, we could look at our oxygen consumption as well. So VO2 would be a measure of internal load as well, which is really, really linked to both of those things, really, your aerobic and anaerobic performance.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think there's very much worthy of a standalone kind of podcast there, looking at the relationship between internal and external cost or load.
Yeah.
And one of the ways we look at that is through things like efficiency and economy, which is kind of my background. But I'm going to move on for the purpose of today. And I want to turn to you and perhaps present an idea to you that is perpetuated by a lot of coaches, which is that there's this magic 10% number in training load, so that you should never increase something by more than 10%. Do you think it's true? And 10% of what? So do you want to touch on kind of the acute to chronic workload ratio there as well?
Yeah, so one of the more popular workload metrics at the moment is that acute to chronic workload ratio, which is basically looking at your current training load for a week compared to the training that you've done over the last 4 weeks or a month. And basically, if your average weekly load over the month is less than the current load that you're doing in that week, it might indicate that you're in an increased risk of injury because you're not accustomed or ready to withstand those loads that you're doing. But like you touched on with internal loads, this doesn't take into account how each individual responds to training. So you can have two people with the same acute chronic workload ratio, but at the end of the day, one person might be really accustomed to lots of high intensity work, and the other person might not be. But if we just take that one metric, we might not be able to get that insight that we're missing there. So yes, it might indicate a potential increased risk factor, but it's hard to use just one metric to say you're at an increased risk without actually understanding those, deeper internal responses that your body's having.
Yeah, it's a key point. I think, let's see, we can measure external load. We might have GPS or access to GPS, or, we might have access to other ways of measuring our external load. Like, for example, a runner or a cyclist, might have Strava and be able to count how many kilometers they're doing per week. But like you said, the same load might be, I guess, experienced completely differently by two different people. So it raises a good point around collecting, really good and worthwhile and meaningful information as well. So, I mean, even just asking the athlete, how they're going, using some level of subjective measure, because subjective measures are pretty good indicators of internal load as well. So you can look at things like session RPE or RPE, or you could look at some sort of subjective wellness questionnaire, creating a questionnaire for your athletes and asking them how they're feeling on a scale of 1 to 10. How are their muscles, soreness, what's their energy levels like, how are they sleeping, these types of things that would tend to indicate some sort of maladaptation to training or overload training.
Definitely.
Well, they give us that other side of the story about stress and strain as well. So stress, how you respond to a single session strain, how you respond to chronic loads, which are those responses outside external load. But came across this article, the Gabat 2020, that was sent to me by a hotshot sports scientist a week or so ago. And one of the interesting lines, I read through it and highlighted something that I thought was the nail in the coffin, for want of a better term. Talking about the acute to chronic workload ratio here, this particular line, it said, "It is no secret that even using a wide range of training load variables obtained from global positioning systems, accelerometers, and player perceived exertion ratings, injury prediction models, including regularized logistic regression, generalized estimating equation, random forest plots, etc., were only able to predict non-contact injuries slightly better than what might be obtained by random chance." So all of this data, all of these mathematical models, and you're probably just as good asking Letty's dog whether or not you're at risk of getting an injury or not.
Yeah. And
Might as well flip a coin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I found with my limited research I did in honours, that it was pretty much useless. It didn't tell us much about predictive ability of an injury in footballers.
So circling back to the story for Charlotte, then, based on what we've just spoken about, measuring load and trying to predict injury, how did they come to the conclusion that Charlotte wasn't ready for performance?
Well, this is the thing. It's not transparent, and how they sort that information isn't abundantly clear as well. Like the fact that you would ask rival teammates and rival coaches whether or not you thought that person was ready to run or return to play without asking the individual. I don't know.
What answers do you reckon you're going to get from your opposition?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, no, she's no good. Give me the Olympic spot. Yeah.
She's the second fastest in the country. Definitely don't ask her.
Yeah. And it does kind of reek of that, I guess, too. But so I'm going to steer the conversation in a slightly different direction then. So we know a bit about training loads and the idea that they're kind of, meant to be able to predict non-contact injuries, but they're not particularly effective at it. What about the other side of that coin, which is when you are injured and you want to return to play? Sam, and one thing I've always struggled with is, what does that pathway look like? And when does someone know that they're ready to return to play? So I'll give you an example. Well, let's use that example. So someone came to you and they had femoral stress. I think it
Stress
was
reaction.
stress reaction, which kind of says to me, I don't know. There's a bit of interpretation there, but maybe some sort of minor stress fracture of the femur. I don't know. Might be speaking out of term there, but
Yeah.
How would you deal with an injury like that? And then when do you know someone's ready to return?
Yeah, they're very good questions. I guess a stress reaction is the point before you get basically a stress fracture or a fracture or a break of the bone. And so the recovery time of this is, pushing 12 weeks, so 3 months. That's a long period out of training for an athlete. Now, in this time, initially you're going to want to deload that athlete because obviously a stress reaction comes from overload. So quickly deloading them. And then you just, throughout that 12 weeks, is basically symptom management. So if they're having, I guess, muscular spasm due to their stress reaction, you're dealing with that. But then you're also gradually returning them into their training loads and assessing how that is going in terms of their symptoms as they go through that recovery period. Now, obviously, the gold standard to assessing this stress reaction would be an MRI or a CT scan or X-ray. So you'd be constantly, I guess, getting that reassessed to ensure that the proper healing process is happening whilst you're going through your rehab. Then as you get towards the end of their rehab period, so that sort of 12 weeks, and depending on the type of bone or the healing process, that can, I guess, either blow out or be a little bit less. But as you get closer, you're obviously going into more sport-specific training before they return into their, I guess, their proper training loads that they should be at that point in time. And so, I guess the way to answer your question of how you assess an athlete's time or readiness to return to training and competition, it's definitely a more collaborative approach in terms of the team medical staff, so doctors and physios, the athlete themselves, and obviously the coach as well. And that sounds very wishy-washy, but a physio can't give the all clear if the athlete themselves is saying they're not ready. So if the athlete is saying that they don't feel physically or psychologically ready, it would be inappropriate to put them back into full training or competition. And vice versa, if the athlete is saying they're psychologically ready to go, but there's something that the coaches or the medical staff is noting that might mean that their performance or their training is not quite up to scratch of where they should be, then that needs to be put forward to the athlete in a more collaborative approach to ensure the athlete doesn't return to training or to competition too soon.
Sorry, go on, Letsy.
Yeah, I have two things to bring up to ask you, Sandon. I'll go with the most recent point you made with their return to training. Is it when they finish with their physio, they're ready to play their sport, or is that the progression, say, to a sports scientist or whoever it might be?
Again, it would probably depend on the situation. If you've got, let's say, someone in Australia playing for an elite AFL club, then they'll finish with the rehab team, so physio and strength and conditioning coach in the rehab side, and progress into, full training. Before they even progress into full training, they'll be doing, 50% of full training, but targeted sort of drills that the team have decided that this person needs to do. And then as they progress more and more, it becomes less in the hands of the physios and the rehab side and more in the hands of the conditioning team and the coaches.
How important is that reloading phase, Sando?
Reloading.
Yeah, how important is that phase from sort of hands-on treatment and symptom management to building up the training load to its previous levels?
Yeah, it's massive.
Yeah.
It's massive.
Yeah.
That you're at a critical point where you'll get to a point where their symptoms are going down, but they're not quite down to, I guess their symptoms are down low enough, but the healing process is still happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so the athlete themselves will feel physically ready to go and really wanting to push things.
Yep.
And that's where it comes down to, physios to sort of, pull back on the reins a little bit. And this is where we sort of clash heads with coaches and athletes, because we know that the proper, tissue healing timeframes and, symptoms will decrease, but you don't want to rush them back too soon, because if you do, unfortunately, there is that, increased risk of, re-injury or potentially another injury. So that reload phase, as you said, is hugely important to the success of your rehab and reintroduction to training and competition.
So and the other one, sorry, you go.
Takeaway message: do your rehab, kids.
Definitely. And on the opposite, so Jared mentioned the reload phase, and this is a debate that I have with athletes all the time when they're injured. Is during that deload phase, does that mean they don't do anything, or is there something they should be doing?
Yeah, look, some athletes would love me to say that a period of rest would be ideal. However, even that would be detrimental to their rehab and performance. Research does show that we shouldn't be completely resting even during a deload phase, because then it takes longer for them to, reintroduce the load again, and also those tissues start to, become less adherent to the load.
You want to minimise the detraining effect, Sandon.
Correct.
Yeah.
So from that example of this little stress reaction, obviously running has caused that. Would something like, say, a bike or some form of exercise that's not loading her impact-wise be appropriate?
Definitely. So, as you said, cycling, potentially swimming, depending on the athlete, but definitely something that's going to help her as a marathon runner maintain her, aerobic fitness and aerobic capacity. So even, a lot of athletes go into things like boxing or that sort of stuff that's
off legs conditioning.
Off legs, yeah. But keeps their aerobic capacity, as high as they can at that period of time. And then, as we all know, some form of, resistance type training as they build back into their load to further condition not just their muscles, but also their bones to increase in loads.
I think that's a really important point you raised there. Let's see, because you can maintain these cardiovascular adaptations, and they're, when we talk about cardiovascular training, we often break it into central and peripheral adaptations. And peripheral adaptations are what happen at the muscle and are often specific to a movement. But central adaptations are what are happening in our heart and lungs and in our blood. And those changes can still occur regardless of the mode. And you can still get a strong aerobic benefit from even reducing the intensity. So those changes around mitochondrial density and increased capillarization, they still happen at very low load. So it doesn't always have to be hard. So there are other things. Just on that, quickly reintroducing load, though, Sando, reminded me what you said. Reminded me of the study of Bayer, which looked at calf strain, and it compared the introduction of of retraining, whether or not it happened 2 days after the injury or 9 days after the injuries. And what they found that when they introduced it 2 days after, that it shortened the return to playtime by 3 weeks without increasing the risk of re-injury. So that 7 days difference from 2 to 9 led to a 21-day difference down the track without an increased risk of injury. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, exactly as I said, it's massive. I guess the quicker you can reintroduce load to that athlete safely, the quicker their recovery will be, and the quicker their return to
Get the kid
training.
off, Warnie.
It's going to be good on the audio, mate. Keep going.
The quicker their return to training and competition will be as well. So just as an example, if someone goes in for knee surgery or hip surgery, looking at whether it be an ACL or even a total hip replacement, they're getting up and walking around day one. So they have the operation in the morning. They're walking around on that surgical hip or knee that afternoon. And so it just shows that, the research or the knowledge around recovery is rapidly changing. And, the old mantra of resting when you're sore, a lot of the time definitely is the incorrect advice given. So as an example for personally, played football on the weekend, was really sore Sunday. So today, Monday, I went and did a lighter sort of gym session, and boys, I feel 50 times better than what I did this morning.
Put on the blood occlusion cuffs and got the biceps peaking.
Oh, hammer curls, concentration curls, barbell
Preacher curls. Yeah, all of them.
So, wanting to circle back to sort of something that our listeners can take away. What can we take away from this discussion around load monitoring, around injury risk management, around return to sport? What can we tell our listeners?
Well, the takeaway I would say is that the predicting injury risk of training load is fraught with danger, and it's probably not something that these selectors should have done. When you are injured, the literature tells us, and of course there's an element of severity in this as well, but generally reintroduction of stimulus is key. The training should be specific to the return to play scenario, and it should be multifaceted. So one thing Sandon said earlier, which is something it's so refreshing to hear, it needs to be a collaborative approach, because one thing that I hear frequently, from physios and exercise physiologists, are these kind of arbitrary cutoffs. I was talking to someone recently about an athlete who had a hamstring strain, and he said that he wouldn't let him return to play unless the difference in eccentric strength in their hamstring, as measured by a Nord board, was within 2% left and right. Now, my question was like, why? Who says? And how is that reflective of?
And what was their baseline pre-injury?
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, and what I learned from my PhD looking at asymmetry is asymmetry is the norm. It's not the exception. And oftentimes it allows athletes to run faster. If you look at Usain Bolt, his performance in the 200 as opposed to Tyson Gay can almost be pinned down to the fact that his right leg is longer than his left, and Tyson Gay, it's the opposite. And Tyson Gay used to struggle to turn around that left side of the bend, and Usain Bolt, I would argue his 200 performance is probably better than his 100 performance, and that might be kind of example of that, where asymmetry is, it's the norm. It's not the exception. But the takeaway point of that is that you can't just have these arbitrary cutoffs and say, well, you need to be able to do 10 single leg squats, or whatever it is. You need to be able to get within 3% on the star excursion balance test left and right, because it doesn't necessarily reflect sport. And so in this case, Charlotte, to circle back, I would say, as all good clubs and tests should do, there should have been a fitness test.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be a marathon, but run her over a 5 and 10K. You're going to know if she's thereabouts. If she comes out and runs a 10K in 34, then yeah, she's progressing well. If she runs a 10K in 44, then she might not have been running much at all. I mean, that's my takeaway. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think one thing that's popped up is that, training load is there for a reason, and we do monitor training load for a reason. It's just not to predict injury. So training load can help us periodize our training. So we can go through periods of intense training and periods of lower training, and measuring training load is important to get that sort of periodization model correct. It's just not a really powerful predictor of injury risk. So it does have a place. Load monitoring does have a place in our sports science. It's just not particularly strong at predicting injury. So I would just put that as a takeaway. So you don't sit there going, well, then why the hell are we collecting all this data if it's not using for anything? It is being used, just not for predicting injury. Yeah.
Just on that as well, it might be used in the injury risk assessment, but not on its own.
Yeah.
Multifaceted, as Warnie said. It might be one facet of that injury risk assessment as well.
I think that nails it on the head. You got to look at the whole picture. You can't just take one aspect of a sport and think that's going to tell you everything about the athlete.
Yeah, well, and that's what we say. All of those things that try to predict injury, like another popular one's a functional movement screen, and its relationship to injury is very poor. The meta-analysis that came out last year, or it might have been 2019, said that they can't support its use as an injury prediction tool, and it's the same with training load, and it's because injury is really, really hard to predict. But it doesn't mean those things are without worth.
Yeah.
It's still good to know, what is someone's external load in relation to their internal load, and in terms of movement screening, how do they move? Can you see whether they have good body awareness or not? And those things, they still have value, just not in injury. Risk from what I have read, but of course there might be a study out there that disproves all of that, and I encourage you to find it.
Well, I think like you said, might not be as related to injury, but for me, performance is where I'm at. I know that Sandon's a bit more that injury side of things. That's his job, is the physio. But as a sports scientist, at the end of the day, you're graded on how well your team performs. So for me, training load can be used to get them ready to perform at the highest level, or perform above what we want them performing at, for example. So we can use that training load to guide the training to get them to a point where physically they're going to be able to perform at the highest possible level.
Yep. Perfect.
100%. Yep.
Another takeaway for me was that, if you are injured, see a physio as soon as possible, because the sooner you start your rehab, the better your outcomes are going to be for return to sport.
Well, not just any physio, mate. One that's got an honours degree in kicks, game-winning goals, preferably.